The wind across the Kansas plains in the autumn of 1896 carried more than just the scent of harvested wheat. It brought with it a silence, an unspoken awareness that something was not right along the dirt road that led past the old Wilkes property. The road itself was narrow, hemmed in by dry cornstalks and skeletal trees whose branches scratched the sky like blackened fingers. Travelers would sometimes see them there, the three sisters standing by the roadside in their pale, starched dresses, ribbons fluttering against the wind, holding tiny slips of paper with Bible verses carefully written in neat cursive. EDOT at first, no one thought much of them. They were the daughters of Reverend Elijah Wilkes, a preacher who had come to Kansas from somewhere back east. No one could quite remember from where. He had taken over the small wooden church in town, but preached only for a short while before, withdrawing from public life entirely. After that, the family was rarely seen except for the girls, who appeared suddenly one summer afternoon, walking alone along the road. They would approach strangers with the same quiet expression, hand over the verse, then turn and walk away without another word. They were, by all appearances, harmless. But the pattern began to take shape slowly, almost too slowly to notice. It started with the traveling salesman who stopped for a drink of water, then the surveyor from Topeka who was mapping farm plots in the area, a seamstress passing through on her way to a cousin's wedding. One by one, they stopped at the Wilkes property after encountering the girls, and one by one they vanished. The land around the Wilkes home was oddly barren, the grass there thinner, the soil darker as though something had bled into it. The house itself stood apart from the world 2 stories of weathered clapboard, its paint long since surrendered to the elements, shutters sagging but still clinging stubbornly to their hinges. The barn leaned at an angle, threatening collapse with every gust of wind. There was no fence to speak of, just a crooked wooden gate that swung in the breeze. The local sheriff, a man named Hartman, was the first to connect the disappearances with the family. But Kansas was a land of long distances and stranger vanishings. He had no proof, and the townsfolk were not eager to stir trouble with a preacher's household, no matter how peculiar. Hartman drove out once, found the girls, seated on the porch, their hands folded neatly in their laps. They did not speak to him. Their father was nowhere to be seen, and the windows behind them were shuttered against the sundown by the time autumn came. The rumors had taken root. Some whispered that the girls were orphans now, their father gone for reasons no one could say. Aloud, others claimed they still saw a tall figure in black move behind the windows at night. Farmers driving their wagons down the dirt road began to quicken their pace when they saw the sisters. A few even turned back entirely, rather than pass the property, but there were always those who didn't. No travelers from distant counties, peddlers with heavy packs, strangers with questions on their lips. The sisters would stand together, near the gate, like sentinels, their dresses spotless despite the dust, their hair pulled back in severe braids. They would hand over a folded slip of paper, and the traveler would read the verse, something from Proverbs or Revelation, before. Continuing up the lane to the house, none of them were ever seen again. What happened on the other side of that crooked gate was a matter of speculation and fear. Some said the house was filled with strange jars and medical instruments, as if someone had once tried to play at being a doctor. Others claimed there was no furniture at all inside, only bare floors and walls covered in pages torn from the Bible. One farmhand swore he saw the cellar door swing open one night, and a pale arm reach out to pull something inside. The truth remained locked away until the winter thaw of 1897. Heavy snow had fallen that year, and when it melted, the county finally took steps to reclaim abandoned properties. The Wilkes land had gone unpaid for in taxes, and no one had seen the family in months. Sheriff Hartman, accompanied by 2 deputies, rode out to the property on a cold, wet morning. their boots sinking into the thawing earth. The front door was unlocked. The smell hit them first, a damp, metallic odor that clung to the air, something between rotting wood and rusted iron. The interior was almost empty. A few chairs, a wooden table scarred by knife marks, and in one corner, a stack of worn hymnals. Dust lay thick over every surface, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were listening. It was in the cellar that they found the truth. The steps were steep, the kind that groaned underfoot, and the deputies had to duck. Beneath the low ceiling, along one wall stood rows of shelves. On each shelf sat glass jars, dozens, perhaps hundreds, each one filled with something pale and irregular. At first, in the gloom, they looked like pebbles. Then one of the deputies lifted a jar toward the light and saw what they truly were. Teeth, human teeth. Small ones, large ones, broken ones, perfectly intact ones. Every jar was labeled with a single date written in a fine, looping hand. The jars stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The sheriff and his men searched the rest of the cellar and found no bodies, no bones, just those countless teeth, preserved in neat, obsessive order. The air was so still down there, it felt as though it had been trapped for years. And in that silence, each man swore he heard the faint sound of something tapping on the glass dot by the time word spread to town. The Wilkes family had become legend. Some believed the sisters were still alive, wandering the back roads under different names. Others swore they had been swallowed up by the land itself, claimed by whatever darkness had taken root in that soil. The house was torn down in the spring. The cellar filled in, but the memory remained. Travelers passing through the area still reported strange encounters. 3 girls standing by the roadside, holding out slips of paper with verses that no one could quite remember after reading. Whatever fate befell the preacher's daughters, it left a mark that time could not erase. And somewhere beneath the layers of earth and history, the jars of teeth may still be waiting. The days after the discovery in the Wilkes cellar passed in a haze of unease, the kind that seems to seep into the very boards of a place. Sheriff Hartman, a man who had faced his share of violence on the plains, found his thoughts returning, again and again, to those shelves of glass jars. He had counted them 147 in total, and yet he knew deep down that the count meant nothing. It was the dates written on each jar that kept him awake at night. The earliest was from the summer of 1893. The latest was from just 7 months before the discovery. The intervals between them were irregular, sometimes only a week apart, sometimes several months. But there was no denying the carefulness of the handwriting, the steady, deliberate script that belonged to someone who took time with each letter, as though each entry were sacred. No bodies had been found on the Wilkes property. No skeletal remains turned up in the thawing fields or the sagging barn. That absence disturbed Hartman more than the jars themselves. Teeth were rarely all that remained of a person, not unless someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the rest was never found. The townsfolk tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the air in town had shifted. The church where Reverend Wilkes had once preached stood mostly empty on Sundays, the pews dusty and the altar flowers wilting in their vases. Mothers forbade their children from playing along the north road, and wagon drivers made wide arcs to avoid the gate to the old property. There were whispers, of course. Theories bloomed like mold in the damp corners of the tavern. Some said the preacher had fallen into madness after his wife's death, though no one could recall seeing Mrs. Wilkes after their arrival in Kansas. Others claimed the girls were not his daughters at all, but orphans he had taken in from some asylum back east. The most unsettling rumors, though, were those that suggested the sisters were not entirely human, that they had come into the world wrong, carrying something dark with them. Hartman tried to trace the family's origins, but records were thin. The Wilkes name appeared in scattered church registries in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but always briefly and always ending with sudden departures. There were no marriage records for Elijah Wilkes in any of the counties he claimed to have lived in. No birth certificates for the girls. It was as if they had stepped into existence the moment they arrived in Kansas and vanished just as abruptly. When the house went silent, the sheriff's unease deepened when he examined the slips of paper found in the front room of the house. Dozens of them, each with a Bible verse written in the same looping hand as the dates on the jars. But the verses chosen were strange passages about teeth gnashing in darkness, about the righteous being separated from the wicked, about bodies being cast away and yet not decaying. They were not the comforting words usually offered by children on a country lane. They were warnings, or perhaps promises. In the weeks that followed, the property became a site of morbid curiosity. Farm hands dared one another to touch the crooked gate. Boys snuck out at night to leave stones on the cellar mound. A peddler claimed he saw lights moving under the soil where the cellar had been filled in, a faint flicker like candlelight. Hartman dismissed most of these stories as the inventions of restless minds, but privately, he felt the land was not done with them yet. It was in early March when the first new disappearance occurred. A cattleman from the western part of the county was last seen heading east along the North Road, hoping to make town before nightfall. He never arrived. His horse was found 2 days later, tethered and grazing near the remains of the Wilkes gate. By then, the sisters had not been seen in months. But the cattleman's neighbor swore under oath that he had glimpsed them that afternoon, 3 figures in white, standing at the far edge of the field, unmoving, their ribbons streaming in the wind. When he looked away to hitch his wagon and glanced back, they were gone. Hartman rode out alone that evening, arriving at the property just as the sun sank into the horizon. The land was still bare, the cellar mound damp from recent rain. He walked the perimeter slowly, noting the way the grass seemed thinner near the gate, as if something beneath the soil was keeping it from taking root. The air had that heavy quality. Again, the kind that seemed to press against the ears. He stood for a long time staring at the place where the house had been. And then, faintly, he thought he heard it, the same delicate tapping he had heard in the cellar months before. It was coming from under the earth. He left quickly after that, but the sound followed him in memory, clicking softly in the quiet moments before sleep. Spring came, and with it a strange change in the land. Wildflowers began to grow along the North Road, but only on the stretch nearest the Wilkes property. The flowers were pale, almost white, their petals so thin the sunlight passed through them. Travelers began reporting that they saw the sisters standing among these flowers at dawn, bending to pluck them one by one. Another disappearance followed in May, a traveling dentist on his way to Wichita. His equipment was later found in the ditch near the property, but not his body. Hartman, unable to ignore the mounting dread, reopened the investigation officially. He questioned every farmer and traveler who had passed through the area, but their accounts were too strange to fit neatly into a report. One man claimed the girls had no shadows. Another said they smiled with mouths that were not their own. By midsummer, even the most skeptical townsfolk began to keep their distance. The road itself grew rutted from disuse, the weeds swallowing its edges. Only the occasional stranger wandered that way, and fewer still returned to tell of it. The sheriff's final attempt to make sense of it came in August. He hired 2 laborers to dig into the cellar mound, hoping to determine whether anything had been left behind. They dug for hours, the sun beating down, until the shovel of one man struck something glassy. It was a jar cracked, but still sealed, half buried in the dark soil. Inside was a single tooth, yellowed and worn, suspended in cloudy liquid. Jar's label bore a date. It was the day before. The laborers refused to continue digging. Hartman, shaken but unwilling to admit defeat, kept the jar in his office for several days before locking it away in the evidence cabinet. But even there, hidden from sight, it seemed to carry its own presence. Clerks complained of a faint tapping sound in the room when no one was inside. By the year's end, Hartman's hair had gone noticeably gray. He spoke less of the Wilkes case and took to avoiding the North Road entirely. But the story lived on, told in whispers over bar counters, and in the quiet back pews of the church. It became part of the county's shadowed history, an account that shifted with each telling, but always returned to the same image: 3 girls in starched white dresses, offering a folded slip of paper to an unsuspecting passerby. And though the Wilkes property remained empty, travelers still claimed to see them in the distance, pale against the horizon, waiting. By the winter of 1898, the Wilkes property had transformed into something more than a place. It had become an idea, a lingering presence that moved freely through conversation and imagination, a place everyone claimed to know but few dared to approach. Its legend fed on absence, on the lack of any explanation, on the unanswered questions, and like anything left untended, it grew. The snow that year came early, blanketing the Kansas plains in silence. Tracks in the snow were easy to follow, yet the Wilkes Road told a different story. No wagon marks, no footprints leading to or from the crooked gate. Just a long, untouched ribbon of white, broken only by the shapes of wind-blown drifts. Even so, travelers swore they had seen movement there, 3 figures in dresses too thin for the cold, standing perfectly still in the field. Some in town insisted the sisters had never left at all, that they had simply shifted into another existence, slipping between moments. Others argued it was nothing more than tricks of the light and restless minds desperate for entertainment during the slow winter months. But no one could explain why the disappearances had stopped only briefly, only to begin again in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sheriff Hartman had grown reluctant to speak of the case, but it was never far from his mind. He kept the cracked jar found that August locked in a small wooden box, tucked away in his desk drawer. From time to time, he would take it out, turn it over in his hands, and study the single tooth floating inside. It seemed ordinary enough a molar, slightly yellowed, but something about it unsettled him more than the shells he'd seen in the cellar. It was the freshness of the date. It was knowing that whoever or whatever had placed it there had done so while the property was being watched. In January, the sheriff received a letter from a Reverend Amos Whitfield of Topeka, a man who claimed to have known Elijah Wilkes during his time in Pennsylvania. The letter was brief, almost curt, but its contents sent a ripple of unease through Hartman. Whitfield wrote that Wilkes had once been a man of fervent conviction, but of dangerous fixations, and that his congregation had dwindled after. He began preaching a gospel of bodily preservation through divine removal. When pressed on what divine removal meant, Whitfield said only that it involved the taking and keeping of the parts of the righteous. Hartman read the letter twice before locking it away with the jar. The following month brought a storm, unlike any the county had seen in years. Winds tore shingles from roofs and left fences flattened. When it passed, the snow lay in deep drifts across the fields, and the Wilkes Road was once again impassable. It was during the thaw, when the snow began to melt into muddy streams, that a group of children from the edge of town returned with a strange story. They claimed to have wandered close to the Wilkes property and seen dozens of glass jars lined up along the surface of the mound where the cellar had been. The jars were gone by the time Hartman arrived. No footprints marked the mud except the small boot prints of the children. Rumors spread quickly. Farmers spoke of finding teeth scattered in their fields, some half buried in the thawing soil. One man claimed to have discovered a tooth in the belly of a fish pulled from the creek. Another swore he had seen a jar bobbing gently against the bank, its label blurred by water, but still visible enough to make out a date dot by early spring. Fear and fascination had drawn strangers to the area. Reporters from Wichita and Kansas City arrived eager for a story. Hartman avoided them, unwilling to have the county's reputation further tarnished. But the strangers brought more than questions. They brought their own vanishings. 2 journalists, both from St. Louis, disappeared. Within a week of one another, after hiring a carriage to take them up the North Road. The driver returned alone, insisting he had dropped them at the Crooked Gate, where 3 young women had been waiting. The driver's account spread faster than any of the sheriff's warnings. Now the legend of the preacher's daughters had taken on new details, their faces too pale for the sun, their eyes an unnatural shade, their movements strangely synchronized. Some versions of the story claimed they spoke in unison, others that they never moved their lips at all. The sheriff, weary of chasing shadows, began studying the pattern of the dates he had copied from the cellar jars. There was no obvious rhythm, no fixed interval between the disappearances, but certain months carried more weight than others. March, June, and September showed the most activity. Hartman wondered if these months aligned with church events or biblical dates. But his search turned up nothing definitive. Then, in late April, a traveling minister named Silas Kane arrived in town, claiming he had come to put the matter of the Wilkes girls to eternal rest. He spoke in the tavern of exorcisms and spiritual cleansing, of rituals that could drive out those who walk in borrowed bodies. Hartman dismissed Kane as a zealot, but others were drawn to his conviction. On a cold morning, Kane set out for the Wilkes property with 3 followers. By nightfall, only 2 of them returned, their eyes wide and their clothes damp with mud. They refused to speak of what had happened, and Kane himself was never seen again. It was then the sheriff began to suspect that the disappearances were not random. The girls, if they still existed in some form, seemed to draw in a certain kind of person those who sought them, who walked willingly through the Crooked Gate. This realization brought him no comfort, for it suggested intent, a purpose behind every lost dot. By the summer of 1898, the county's map still marked the Wilkes property as abandoned land, but the truth was something else entirely. Travelers continued to vanish, and sightings of the sisters came in from farther afield along back roads 20 miles away, in towns where no one had ever heard of the Wilkes name. Always together, always silent, always offering the same folded slip of paper, Hartman began to wonder if the property itself was only the starting point, a place where something had first rooted itself before spreading outward. The thought came to him often, unbidden, in the quiet hours before dawn. He began to dream of teeth, not in jars, but scattered like seeds, sprouting pale, bone-white flowers that swayed without wind. The jar in his drawer remained sealed, the tooth inside unchanged. But one morning in September, he noticed something he swore had not been there before, a faint crack running across the glass, so fine it could only be seen when the light caught it just so. He locked the drawer and left it untouched, though from that day forward he sometimes thought he could hear a faint rattle from within, as though something inside was shifting against the glass. The Wilkes case had begun as a local curiosity, then a scandal, then a haunting. By the end of that year, it had become something more, a quiet, creeping dread that seemed to move with the wind, that settled in the bones of anyone who heard the story. People no longer spoke of when it would end. They spoke only of how far it would spread. And always there were the verses, those strange, warning verses that spoke of darkness, of gnashing teeth, of judgment that came not in fire, but in the taking apart of the body. Hartman kept them hidden in his desk, but he had read them enough times to know them by heart. He sometimes wondered if that was the point, if the sisters had known that anyone who read their words might carry them forever, unable to shake their meaning. The land where the Wilkes house once stood remained quiet, but quiet in the way of a storm holding its breath. The turn of the century brought little relief to the county. By 1900, the Wilkes property had been abandoned for over 3 years, yet its influence seemed to grow rather than fade. It no longer belonged to the land records or to the sheriff's jurisdiction. It belonged to the realm of the half-seen and the half-believed, a space where stories outpaced evidence. But even stories leave traces, and in this case, the traces were scattered like breadcrumbs across the plains. The first sign that year came in the thaw of March. A farmhand named Lyle Dorsey found his cattle gathered near a section of fence that bordered the overgrown Wilkes Road. The animals stood motionless, staring in the same direction, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. When Dorsey followed their gaze, he saw 3 figures in white, standing just beyond the fence line. The frost was still clinging to their dresses, and each girl held something cupped in her hands. He called out, though later he could not explain why, and in an instant they were gone, replaced by nothing more than the swaying stalks of last year's dead grass. 2 days later, Dorsey fell ill with a fever that would not break. Before the week was out, 2 of his molars came loose and dropped into his hand while he was eating bread. The doctor who examined him said it was an odd case of rapid infection, but privately admitted he'd never seen anything like it. The teeth were healthy before they fell. There was no decay, no sign of damage. Just absence. By April, others began to report similar happenings, strangers passing through who claimed to wake with blood on their pillows and empty spaces in their mouths. A traveling schoolteacher from Nebraska told the tavern crowd that she had lost 3 teeth during a single night's stay in the county, though she had no memory of pain. She left the next morning, and no one ever saw her again. Sheriff Hartman took note of these events with a growing sense of inevitability. He had long suspected that the jars in the cellar were not trophies, but something more deliberate parts of some slow, ongoing collection. The question was whether the girls were still behind it, or whether the land itself had taken on their work. In late spring, the crooked gate collapsed under its own rot. The county discussed removing it entirely, but the matter stalled. Even without a standing gate, the Wilkes property retained its boundary, an invisible threshold that few dared to cross. On warm nights, the fireflies seemed to gather thickest there, their lights flickering in strange patterns as if signaling. It was during one of these nights that a young reporter named Clara Mason arrived from Chicago. She had read an old article on the Wilkes case and convinced her editor to let her pursue it as part of a series on rural mysteries. Mason was not the first to come chasing the story, but she was the first in years to approach it with methodical intent. She spent days speaking to locals, mapping disappearances, and walking the roads where the sisters had once been seen. The sheriff, wary but cooperative, showed her the cracked jar. She studied it without touching, her brow furrowing at the sight of the label. "You realize," she said, "that this date matches the day after you found it. It's almost as if the act of looking for it placed it there." Hartman didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. On the 3rd night of her visit, Mason insisted on walking to the Wilkes property alone. She left before sunset, carrying only a notebook and a lantern. The sheriff offered to accompany her, but she refused. "I need to see it the way they saw it," she explained. She never returned. By morning, her lantern was found extinguished at the edge of the mound where the cellar had once been. Her notebook lay open a few feet away, its last page filled with a single line written over and over. "They are not gone." The disappearance of a journalist brought fresh attention to the county. Detectives from Wichita were dispatched, but they found nothing. The land swallowed their questions as it had so many others. A case was filed, as always, under missing person, though privately the sheriff knew it belonged to another category entirely, one that the law had no name for. That year was dry and relentless, the heat pressing down on the fields like a hand. The Wilkes road cracked in places, and the wildflowers that had once grown pale and delicate along its edges withered to brown husks. Yet travelers still claimed to see the girls sometimes at great distance, sometimes close enough to make out the ribbons in their hair. A peddler passing through in August told a story that unsettled even the most hardened locals. He said he had been walking along the North Road at dusk when the girls appeared ahead of him, holding out slips of paper as they always had. He did not take them. Instead, he stepped aside to let them pass. They did not turn their heads, but as they went by, he heard a faint clinking sound, like glass jars brushing together. That sound would return in other accounts. Farmers working their fields claimed to hear it at night, carrying on the wind from the direction of the Wilkes land. One man swore he found a line of teeth half buried along the furrow where he had just plowed, each spaced evenly apart as if set deliberately by the fall. Hartman's health had begun to fail. He was an old man now, worn down by years of unanswered questions. He spent more time in his office than at home, his gaze often lingering on the drawer where the jar was kept. The crack in the glass had widened, though the liquid inside remained sealed. The tooth had shifted position, now leaning against the inner wall as if pressed there. He began to dream of the cellar again, not the damp, silent place he had entered years ago, but a living version, the shelves stretching endlessly, the jars multiplying faster than they could be counted. In these dreams, he was always aware of something moving just out of sight, the faint brush of skirts against the floor. The first frost of November, a wagon driver from a neighboring county stopped in town, pale and trembling. He claimed to have seen the three girls at a crossroads 10 miles from the Wilkes property. They stood at the center, holding hands, their dresses pristine despite the mud. As his wagon approached, they opened their mouths in unison, not to speak, but to smile. He swore their teeth were not human. Whether the man was drunk, fevered, or telling the truth, no one could say. But his account was enough to revive the old fear, the knowledge that whatever haunted the county was not bound to the property anymore. It had taken to the roads, to the spaces between towns, to any place a traveler might be caught alone by year's end. The Wilkes name was rarely spoken aloud. The sisters had become them, or the girls, or simply the three. Their story no longer belonged to a family history. It belonged to the land itself, and to the countless missing who had crossed an invisible threshold and never returned. The jars from the cellar were long gone, but in the sheriff's drawer, the single cracked one remained. On some nights, Hartman thought he saw condensation forming on the inside of the glass, as if something alive were breathing within. He told himself it was only the trick of the light. But deep down, he knew better. The land did not let go, and neither did they. The winter of 1854 dragged its shadow across the valley, a season of muted colors and brittle air. Snow lay heavy over the grounds of the convent, blanketing the garden in an unnatural stillness. Yet beneath that frozen crust, something stirred, a whisper that did not belong to the wind. It began with Sister Agnes, whose duties included tending the outer walls and clearing the pathways that led to the graveyard. She had been among the first to notice the stones shifting, not collapsing, not crumbling under frost, but shifting, as though the earth beneath them breathed in slow, shallow intervals. She mentioned it to no one at first. The church discouraged idle speculation, especially in matters involving the dead. But on the night of January 19th, a blizzard rolled through the valley, its icy grip sealing doors and rattling windows. By morning, when the sisters ventured out, they found 3 of the oldest stones had moved several inches, leaning forward as though bowing toward the convent. The diocesan archivist, Father Thaddeus Leary, was summoned from Albany. He arrived, swaddled in black wool, his eyes already narrowed as though anticipating something unpleasant. He listened to Sister Agnes' account in silence, then walked the perimeter alone, his boots crunching through crusted snow. He crouched by one of the tilted stones, brushing away the ice to reveal the inscription. The name had worn away centuries ago, but beneath it fresh gouges marked the granite. Not the etching of tools, but scratches, thin and deliberate. The sisters expected Father Leary to bless the ground and return to the city. Instead, he requested access to the locked garden. Maps, those sealed since 1855 under diocesan decree. When reminded that the seal was not to be broken for another 70 years, he simply stared at Mother Superior until she fetched the key. Inside the chapel's archive room, the map was unfurled. The parchment crackled like dry skin, its edges stained with something darker than dust. The drawings were meticulous rows of burial plots neatly aligned, each marked with a small cruciform symbol. But in the southwest corner, under a shaded sketch of a lilac grove, the symbols changed. They were not crosses at all, but circles intersected with jagged lines. Symbols no sister could identify. Father Leary did not explain them. He only copied them into his own ledger and asked to see the rosaries found in the disturbed graves the previous summer. The sisters hesitated. Those rosaries were not of local make dark wood, strung on unfamiliar wire, with crucifixes whose Christ figures bore expressions more pained than serene. When placed in Father Leary's hands, they seemed heavier than they should have been. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to leak beyond the convent walls. The gravedigger's apprentice claimed to have heard tapping beneath the soil while clearing snow. A baker's wife swore she saw candlelight moving between the stones at night. The village children dared one another to press their ears to the ground, though none lasted more than a heartbeat before fleeing. One late afternoon, as the sun bled pale light through a veil of snow, Father Leary returned to the site alone. He carried no holy water, no censer, only the map, his ledger, and a small iron pry bar. He chose the stone most recently shifted, the one closest to the lilac grove. Digging was nearly impossible in the frozen ground, yet he worked until his breath came in clouds and his gloves stiffened with ice. What he uncovered was not a coffin. It was a wooden crate, no larger than a bread box, wrapped in layers of oilcloth. The nails were old, blackened by time, but the cloth was strangely intact. He carried it inside, setting it upon the table in the convent scriptorium. The sisters gathered, drawn by a mix of dread and duty. The first layer of cloth peeled away to reveal another, this one embroidered with the same jagged line circle symbols from the map. Beneath that was the crate itself, its lid carved with faint lettering in a language no one present could read. When Father Leary pried it open, the scent that escaped was neither rot nor earth. It was sweet, cloying like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Inside lay a bundle of parchment sheets, tightly rolled and bound with sinew. Alongside them rested a rosary, unlike the others. The beads were made of some pale, porous material, and the crucifix bore no figure at all, only an empty cross. Leary unbound one scroll. The ink was dark, almost oily, and the writing curved in unnatural arcs, looping back on itself. Sister Agnes swore the letters seemed to shimmer, as if refusing to be seen clearly. He read silently, lips tightening, and rolled it up again without a word. That night he requested a small cell to sleep in. The sisters heard him muttering prayers well past midnight, but by morning he was gone. His ledger, the crate, and the scrolls vanished with him. For days, no one knew his fate until a fisherman on the Hudson found his body lodged against the pier, his skin pale and hands curled as if gripping something in death. No crate, no scrolls, no rosary. The coroner's report was brief: exposure and drowning. The church's report was briefer still: a tragic accident in the Lord's winter. But Sister Agnes could not forget the symbols, nor the way the stones leaned closer to the convent after each storm. She began secretly recording the positions of the graves, sketching the angles of their tilts. By early March, her drawings revealed a pattern. The stones, in their gradual shifting, were forming a spiral. At its center lay the lilac grove. Grove itself had withered in recent years, the soil beneath turning black as if burned from within. In spring, when the snow melted, the sisters avoided it entirely. Yet Agnes, with quiet resolve, pushed through its skeletal branches one dusk. In the center, she found another stone, half buried, unmarked save for a single, deep groove running from top to base dot. She touched it, expecting the chill of granite. Instead, the surface felt faintly warm, as if something within radiated heat. Despite the frost, she pulled back her hand at once, her pulse quickening. That night, she dreamed of the spiral, only it was no longer made of stones, but of kneeling figures, their heads bowed toward the lilac grove. In her dream they began to rise one by one dot when spring arrived. So too did a letter from the diocesan chancery. It bore no signature, only a wax seal with the same jagged line circle emblem. A message inside was a single line: "Do not move the stones." The sisters obeyed, though none could say why. The graves continued their slow, deliberate shift. The lilac grove, once bare, sprouted in unnatural bursts, its flowers deep crimson instead of violet. By summer's end, the spiral was nearly complete. Sister Agnes stopped sketching after that. The patterns no longer needed to be drawn. They could be seen plainly from the chapel's highest window, curling toward the center like a tightening noose. And on the first night of autumn, when the moon hung low and orange over the valley, the wind carried something through the convent halls. Not a draft, not a whisper, Dot. It was the sound of stones settling, followed by the faint, deliberate click of rosary beads somewhere beneath the ground. The courthouse archive smelled of paper decay and mildew, the kind of air that clung to the inside of your lungs long after you'd left. Afternoon light slipped through narrow windows, dust turning in slow spirals as I stood among shelves of bound ledgers, folded land surveys, and brittle legal transcripts tied with fraying twine. Somewhere in this silence, the truth of the Kellner estate was buried. And silence, I was starting to realize, was more dangerous than denial. It was intentional, Dot. The box I sought had been catalogued in the early 1870s, then resealed by county order less than a year later. Its inventory label read only: Estate, Holdings, Kellner House, Confidential. The deputy archivist, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Delacroix, glanced at me twice before fetching the iron key from a locked cabinet. "You open that," she said. "You'll wish you hadn't." It wasn't a threat, just a weary observation, like a nurse warning you. The wound was worse than you imagined. The lid creaked open, the hinges sighing like they'd been holding their breath for 50 years. Inside were not only land deeds and property records, but something else entirely. Sketched floor plans of the Kellner house, not as it had been photographed in the newspapers, but as it existed before the fire before. Walls had been rebuilt and basements bricked over. There were 3 cellars marked, not one. And beneath the east wing, a series of narrow chambers, accessible only through a trapdoor, hidden beneath the parlor's floorboards. The drawings were precise, with neat annotations in German and occasional English measurements, materials, cryptic notes like Licht, verboten, light forbiddens, and Zugang nur im Schlossel 3, access only with key 3. Whatever had been down there was never meant for the public, and possibly not even for the rest of the household staff. My hands stayed on the paper longer than they should have, the edges biting into my fingertips as though the map itself resisted being moved. Beneath, the blueprints lay a smaller envelope sealed with black wax, brittle but unbroken. I cracked It opened and slid out several photographed sepia portraits, poorly framed, of children. None of them smiled. Some stared directly into the lens. Others looked away as if commanded to. Their faces were streaked with dirt, their clothing too thin for the apparent season. Each photograph was marked with a date and a single initial in the corner. F, 1862, L, 1863, H, 1864. The names, if they existed, were stripped away. It struck me that these were not family keepsakes. They were records. Inventory of a different kind. I left the courthouse with the map rolled tight in my satchel, the photographs wrapped in an oilskin sleeve. The walk back through town felt different. The clap of my boots on the cobblestones too loud, every face a little too knowing. In the Kellner story, everyone was either a witness or a keeper of the lie, and I wasn't yet sure which side I'd be forced to join. By nightfall, I had arranged entry into the Kellner house under the pretense of surveying the fire damage for the Historical Commission. The caretaker, a man in his late 60s with hands like knotted rope, didn't ask many questions. "Parlor's unstable," he warned, leading me in through the side door. The smell hit me first charred oak and something damp, metallic. Mold and rust, maybe. Or something older. The parlor floor was a patchwork of scorched boards and newer planks that didn't quite match the original grain. I crouched low, tracing the blueprint's measurements against the space. And then I saw it a hairline seen between boards, running in a perfect rectangle. The trapdoor's edge. It took an hour of careful prying to work the nails loose without splintering the wood. The caretaker lingered in the hallway, his presence more shadow than substance. When the final nail gave way, the door lifted with a groan, revealing a set of steep, narrow steps descending into blackness. The air that rose up was colder than the rest of the house, tinged with something mineral and sour. I lit my lamp and descended. The steps ended in a cramped corridor. B. Walls braced with aging timbers slick with condensation. The first chamber I entered was small, its ceiling low enough to force me into a half-crouch. Iron rings were set into the walls at regular intervals, each with a length of corroded chain dangling loose. The floor was packed earth, uneven, with shallow depressions, like footprints, pressed deep and never smoothed over. One corner held a wooden crate, its lid warped and ajar. Inside, I found 3 glass bottles unlabeled, each with a residue the color of old honey. The second chamber was worse. Wooden partitions divided the space into coffin-sized stalls, each with a sliding door. I counted 7 in total. Inside one, a child's shoe lay on its side, the leather cracked and curling. Another held only a scrap of cloth, patterned faintly with a faded blue print. I didn't want to imagine the rest. The third chamber, however, was different, larger. The walls here were lined not with timber, but with stacked stone, fitted with uncanny precision. A table stood in the center, its surface scarred by cuts and burns. Above it, a rusted hook dangled from a ceiling beam, swaying ever so slightly in the draft. Along the far wall, an alcove was set into the stone, holding a metal box about the size of a strong man's trunk. Its lock was gone, but the lid was so rusted it resisted my first pull. When it finally gave way, I saw it was filled with notebooks small, cloth-bound, their pages mottled with damp. The handwriting inside was the same as the annotations on the blueprints, but what it recorded was no ledger of goods or wages. Each entry listed a date, an age, and a brief description. March 4th, 1863, M, 8 years, refuses broth. May 12th, 1863, F, 11 years, taken to room 3. June 1st, 1863, H, 9 years, illness worsening, to be replaced. The language was clinical, detached, as if these were livestock rather than human beings. I don't know how long I stayed down there, reading by the dim halo of my lamp. The entries stretched over 3 years, ending abruptly in late 1865. The final page read simply, "No further arrivals. Seal rooms. Burn excess." When I emerged back into the parlor, my hands were black with dust and something else that smelled faintly of rusted iron. The caretaker met my eyes only once, then turned away. "You found what you were looking for?" he asked quietly. I couldn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because the truth was worse than I'd imagined, and because once you speak it aloud, it becomes yours to carry. That night, I laid the photographs beside the ledger entries, matching initials to faces. Some matched exactly. Others were close enough to chill me. The dates aligned with gaps in the town's census records. Children unaccounted for, their absence explained away by fever, by fire, by relocation. But in the shadows beneath the Kellner house, those explanations didn't hold. And then there was the unanswered question. Where had they gone after the last entry? Burn excess. Did that mean what I feared it did? Or was there another layer, deeper still, hidden beyond even the trapdoor's reach? The blueprints seemed to suggest more. Faintly etched in the margins was a note I hadn't noticed before. Zweiter Zugang, Nordwand, second access, north wall. I'd seen no such passage, which meant either it had been sealed long ago, or it was still waiting in the dark. The weight of the house pressed on me even after I left, the memory of the damp air and the uneven floor clinging like a second skin. The town outside was quiet, but not in a peaceful way, more like the silence that follows a scream when everyone knows what happened, but no one will speak of it. The courthouse in Marlowe County had never been known for its warmth. Its walls, a patchwork of soot-stained limestone, seemed to absorb more than just the dust of passing years. They held the silence of things unspoken. On a damp morning in 1874, that silence was broken when a carpenter named Jonah Clay discovered an object that would ignite the most dangerous phase of the investigation. A ledger, hidden beneath the warped oak floorboards of the abandoned East. Wing. Clay had been hired to make the place presentable for a storage conversion. But when his chisel struck something hollow, the sound was unmistakable. Peeling back the boards, he found a long wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay a book whose leather cover had rotted to the texture of damp paper. He could not read much, the ink had faded, but what remained legible made him pale. It wasn't the names alone that unsettled him. It was the pairing, each name aligned with a date, a location, and a cryptic notation dot. He handed the book to the sheriff without saying a word. By nightfall, the sheriff had handed it to our research team. The ledger was unlike anything we'd seen. Most entries were written in a precise hand, but every so often a different penmanship appeared, hurried, almost frantic, as though someone had been recording information moments before being discovered. The early pages were the most chilling. Names of children aged between 6 and 15, listed in chronological order from 1839 to 1852. Next to each was an abbreviated location. CRGN, St. NTH, LHTD. These matched with known parish designations. The final column was the most disturbing. Short codes like L3 or H6. At first, the codes meant nothing, but cross-referencing them against burial records and census losses revealed a grim pattern. L marked those buried locally, often in unmarked graves. H denoted transfers to holding sites' temporary storage before final disposal. It wasn't a record of life. It was a record of systematic disappearance. I sat across from Dr. Althea Morin, a forensic historian, as she laid the book on a table lit only by a single desk lamp. Her latex-gloved hands turned the pages slowly, as if moving too quickly might disturb whatever malevolent trace still clung to the paper. "These aren't just records," she said softly. "They're instructions someone's operational. Log." We found, embedded in the margins, faint imprints from pressed writing on torn-out pages. Using raking light photography, we recovered fragments of a name, B. Lachetta, figure long rumored in whispers about the county's disappeared. Until now, no archival proof of his existence had ever surfaced. The ledger's most dangerous revelation lay toward the back. A section from 1857 detailed realignment. Orders lists of individuals to be moved from the east cellars of the parish orphanage to Sect G, beneath N Choir. This was not a metaphor. Beneath N Choir was a direct reference to the subterranean crypts under the north choir stalls of St. Bartholomew's. The church, which had burned in 1869, had never been excavated. The idea that the remains of dozens, perhaps hundreds of missing children could still lie beneath that patch of scorched earth was almost too much to contemplate. But it was there, in black and fading brown, scrawled in human hand dot. When we took our findings to the diocesan archivist, his demeanor shifted the moment he saw the book. His measured politeness vanished, replaced by an instinctive recoil. "You have no right to hold this," he said flatly. "It is property of the church." His hands trembled when he reached for it. We refused to hand it over without a court order, and the conversation ended in cold formality. Within 48 hours, 2 of our local contacts reported being followed. At night by men in long coats who vanished when confronted. The tension deepened when we discovered that the ledger's timeline aligned perfectly with the tenure of a certain Father H. Caldwell, a priest whose personal effects had been lost in the fire of 1869. Caldwell had been the head of the parish orphanage and, according to oral accounts from descendants of staff, was known for sudden, unexplained night inspections of children's dormitories. No accusations had ever been formalized, at least none that survived in the public record. One night, while reviewing the ledger's codes again, I realized something I had overlooked. The numbers following L and H weren't sequential burial IDs. They corresponded to known parish donation ledgers from the same years. The higher the number, the larger the donor associated with that case. In other words, these weren't mere notations, they were payment tiers. The horror shifted then, from the abstract to the transactional. We were no longer looking at passive record-keeping. We were staring at the receipts of a marketplace in human lives. By early autumn, word of our possession of the ledger had leaked. A letter arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a single scrap of parchment bearing 7 words. Written in looping black ink, "Some books are buried for a reason." The implication was clear. Stop digging. But by then, stopping was no longer possible. Every name in that ledger was a person whose story had been erased. To turn away now would be to cooperate in their continued burial. We assembled a covert team to visit the former site of St. Bartholomew's. By night, using ground-penetrating radar, we scanned beneath the charred grass. The machine's display, lit with anomalies-tight clusters of disturbance, consistent with human burials, just 6 to 8 feet below the surface. One of the technicians muttered, "That's not random." He was right. The clusters matched the ledger's groupings almost exactly. We documented the scans, but kept the location secret. An official dig would require permits that the diocese would never grant. Worse, disturbing the site without proper preparation risked destroying fragile evidence. The following week, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. While searching probate records for the name B. Lachette, we found a will dated 1862. It left all ledgers and maps pertaining to cellar work to a private benefactor in New York. That benefactor's estate had been auctioned in 1901, its contents scattered. If those maps survived, they could show not just burial locations, but also the original cellar structures before the church fire structures. We suspected had been used to hold the children before their deaths. The deeper we went, the more we realized the ledger was less a complete account and more a fragment of a much larger network of documentation, scattered like bones across decades. There was one final entry in the ledger dated February 13th, 1868, that chilled me more than any other. It contained no name, no code, only a sentence. Transfer complete. Silence to follow. It was written in that hurried, irregular hand, as if the writer feared discovery even in the act of writing. 3 months later, historical weather reports recorded the heaviest spring flood in county history, which destroyed several riverbank warehouses. Some believed that flood was natural. I no longer did. It felt orchestrated, an erasure disguised as disaster. Holding that ledger, I understood why it had been buried under courthouse floorboards. Whoever placed it there must have known its contents were dangerous enough to warrant hiding, yet valuable enough to preserve. Perhaps they believed someone someday would find it and understand. And now that someone was us. We closed the box, wrapped it again in fresh oilcloth, and stored it in a vault under a name that meant nothing to outsiders. But the damage was already done the moment the ledger surfaced. The past began pressing against the present, demanding to be heard, and as we would soon learn, the ledger was not alone. There were other books, other codes, other floorboards waiting to be lifted. By the summer of 1848, whispers had swelled into a kind of quiet rebellion. Those who still clung to faith in the institution could no longer meet the eyes of those who had lost everything inside its walls. In the marketplace, in the pews, at riverfront gatherings, the question slipped from mouths in trembling tones. What are they hiding up there? The asylum's facade had always been its shield-tall limestone, polished walkways, the spire of its chapel like a blade pointing heavenward. To outsiders, it radiated order. But the people who lived close enough to hear the night screams, who had seen wagons arrive after dusk and leave before dawn, felt the truth pressing against their ribs like a second heartbeat. One such person was Samuel Keating, a retired county surveyor whose property bordered the southern field. For years, Keating had watched the land change in ways that didn't match the official records. He knew where the old stream had run before it was filled in, where the soil was softer, where the ground sank slightly after a long rain. In June, while walking the edge of his property, he noticed something the institution hadn't accounted for: a patch of earth recently disturbed, not large enough for construction, but certainly too deliberate for gardening. He marked the spot quietly, using a bent iron rod, and told no one, not yet. In a place where even the wind seemed to carry secrets to listening ears, trust had become a dangerous currency. Inside the asylum, staff began noticing shifts in routine. Hallways once patrolled casually were now guarded with stiff-backed precision. The matron's office light burned late into the night. And in the laundry wing, a young washerwoman named Ruth, barely 17, found herself laundering sheets marked with stains that water could never fully erase. The stains were older than the week's work. Older, perhaps, than the women who now lay silent in the North Ward. Ruth had been raised to believe silence was safety, but she also carried her late father's stubbornness like an heirloom. In July, she slipped one of those sheets into her apron and took it home, folding it carefully into the cedar chest where her mother stored winter linens. If anyone came for it, she told herself, then she would know for certain that the danger was real. By mid-August, events began stacking upon one another like rotting timber, ready to collapse. First came the disappearance of Margaret Halloran, one of the few patients who still had regular visits from family. Her brother arrived on a Thursday, bringing bread and small comforts, only to be told she had been transferred for advanced care. When he pressed for the location, the answer shifted first to a distant sanatorium, then to a private convalescent home, then silence. He returned the next day with the sheriff, but the asylum's ledgers had been amended overnight. Margaret Halloran's name had vanished entirely. Then came the flood. A storm unlike any in recent memory lashed the county, tearing shingles from rooftops and forcing the river to claw hungrily at its banks. The asylum's south field became a shallow pond, and Keating's marked patch of earth softened into something closer to mud. When the waters receded 2 days later, they left behind what the grass had been hiding, a warped piece of pine jutting from the soil like the corner of a box. Keating did not approach it immediately. He stood there, the smell of the floodwater mixing with something else, sweet, metallic, and wrong. When he finally returned with a spade, the pine gave way with a groan. Beneath it was fabric. Beneath the fabric, Bone.News spread quickly, though. Not officially. A handful of locals gathered under cover of darkness to see for themselves, their boots sinking into the sodden earth. No one spoke loudly. The night air felt as if it would crush their words before they reached the tree line. They uncovered more than one box before the first torchlight appeared on the horizon. The asylum's men, arriving faster than any neighborly concern could explain. The bodies were removed before dawn, loaded onto a covered wagon that creaked, away toward the northern road. By sunrise, the field looked undisturbed again. But the people who had been there, who had seen the slack-jawed skulls and water-swollen hands, carried that image like a curse. Meanwhile, within the asylum walls, Ruth discovered her cedar chest had been rifled through. The sheet was gone. Number. Door in her small boarding room showed signs of being forced, yet her key still hung at her waist. That night, she found a slip of paper tucked beneath her pillow, 4 words in neat, slanted script. You are not safe. For weeks, she debated leaving. But where would she go? The asylum paid in coin, not in recommendations, and without character. References, she would be little more than a wanderer with whispers at her back. So she stayed, though she began keeping her boots near the bed and a length of iron under her pillow. In September, a man named Reverend Carter began visiting the county from the neighboring parish. His sermons, offered in borrowed pulpits, focused not on salvation, but on the dangers of moral rot within institutions meant to protect. He never mentioned the asylum by name, but his imagery was sharp enough to draw knowing glances from the congregation. Carter claimed to have read sealed records, though when pressed, he would only say the truth was buried under bureaucratic stone. The asylum took notice. The matron sent 2 men to invite Carter for a discussion. He did not return that evening. Days later, a letter appeared in the post office, addressed to no one and everyone. Watch the south field. The ground gives up what paper cannot dot by the first frost. The field had indeed given more. Children playing along the property line found a rusted clasp and chain protruding from the dirt. When pulled, it revealed the shredded remnants of a woman's bodice, still buttoned. No one reported it directly to the authorities. Instead, it passed from hand to hand like contraband, a relic of something unspeakable. At night, the asylum's lamps burned brighter than ever, and its walls seemed to draw in closer, as though guarding not just its inmates, but itself. The townsfolk felt the weight of watching and being watched, of living within sight of something vast and malignant. The daylight truth was this: the asylum had ceased to be merely a building. It was now an organism, self-protecting, fed by fear, and capable of reshaping its own history as easily as ink dries on a page. The records could be altered, the graves concealed, the witnesses scattered, but the land remembered. And when the land remembered, it told its story in ways no man could fully erase. As winter approached, Samuel Keating stopped walking the southern field. Ruth stopped laundering after dark. And in the markets, when the asylum's men passed through to purchase supplies, people stepped aside, not out of respect, but to keep from catching whatever shadow followed them. Yet beneath the frozen crust of the south field, the earth still shifted slightly after each thaw, as if something beneath it was straining toward the light. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, the thought persisted in every mind that had seen the pine boxes. One day, the ground would no longer be able to keep its secrets. The winter of 1881 was colder than memory allowed. The streets outside St. Harlow's Orphan Asylum were lined with brittle snow, crusted like glass, crunching under carriage wheels and the stiff boots of men who never looked up. It was a season of locked doors, where the poor huddled in alleys and the wealthy retreated into drawing rooms, pretending they could not hear the wind rattle against their shutters. Inside the asylum, the air was equally cold, though not from the weather. Father Calder had been dead for 6 weeks. Officially, it was pneumonia. Unofficially, whispers claimed his heart gave out while prying into something he should have left. Buried. His replacement, a pale and quietly severe priest named Father Merrin, had arrived without luggage beyond a single leather folio. It never left his side. By January, most of the asylum staff had returned to their routines. But Matthew Cray, the asylum's handyman and part-time gravedigger, had not. He'd been Calder's only friend, and whatever Calder had told him, in his final days, had left him pale as linen. The others avoided asking questions. One evening, Matthew appeared at the back door of the asylum kitchen. He carried an oilskin-wrapped bundle. Cook Agnes let him in without a word. Upstairs, in the laundry loft where no one ventured after dark, he unwrapped the bundle before Sister Eloise, the only nun still willing to speak to him. Inside was a folded parchment map, brittle with age. It was a map of St. Harlow's grounds, but not the grounds as they existed now. Instead, the drawing showed a much larger property, extending into what was now the public square, the old tram lines, and the brick warehouses along Wharf Street. Most chilling were the markings, tiny crosses inked in faded rust brown. 34. Of them, their graves, Matthew said flatly, his breath visible in the cold loft air. But not in the cemetery. These are under the old garden. Calder found this in the sealed property ledgers. That's why he didn't finish. Sister Eloise touched one of the crosses with her gloved finger. This garden was torn up when the diocese expanded the west wing. You mean to say that there are bodies, Matthew interrupted, and not where anyone's supposed to find them. The map had a date, 1841, the year St. Harlow's was built, and in the bottom corner, in writing so fine it was almost invisible, were initials E.M.C. Eloise recognized them instantly. Eliza Margaret Channing, the asylum's first matron, rumored even in her own lifetime to be God's handmaiden in public and something far darker in private. Calder had been obsessed with Channing's years. There were no baptism records for dozens of children supposedly under her care. No death notices, no adoptions. They had simply vanished. And now here was a map suggesting where at least 34 of them ended up. For days, Matthew and Eloise said nothing. The map remained wrapped in oilskin, hidden in the false bottom of a laundry trunk. Then, on the night of January 17th, something happened that forced their hand. The snow outside had begun to thaw. The west garden, what little remained of it, was sodden and slick. A delivery boy, cutting across the grounds, tripped on something, protruding from the earth. He thought it was a root. It was not. It was a rosary. But the beads were not the smooth wood common to Catholic gifts. They were carved from something harder, whiter. Matthew knew bone when he saw it. By morning, the boy was gone, sent home to his family, no doubt sworn to silence. But Matthew saw. The way Father Merrin lingered at the window, watching the garden with a stillness that felt almost predatory. Whatever Merrin carried in that leather folio, it seemed tied to the same truth Calder had died chasing. That night, Matthew and Eloise, made a decision. If the map was to be believed, the garden held the remains of 36 souls, hidden beneath the feet of the living for 40 years. They would dig. Not in daylight, not where they could be stopped. But they would dig. The first night yielded. Nothing but wet roots and clay. The second night, a fragment cloth discolored, the weave too fine to be gardener's rags. The third night, Eloise's spade hit something hollow. She knelt in the mud and cleared it with her hands. It was a small coffin. No more than 3 feet long dot, inside were bones. A child's. The rosary lay where the sternum should have been, looped as though clutched in prayer. But the beads were wrong again, too pale, too porous. And there was no jawbone. Eloise closed the coffin before Matthew could see more. Her face was unreadable. "We take this to the bishop," she said. But when they returned the next evening, the coffin was gone. So was the disturbed earth. It was as if the grave had never been touched. In its place was a single object, the leather folio. It was open, its contents gone, save for one sheet of paper bearing a warning in the same fine hand as the map. The soil does not forget, but it does not forgive either. That night, Matthew dreamed of children's voices beneath the floorboards, of the laundry loft, calling names he did not recognize. He woke to find the map unwrapped on the table, though neither he nor Eloise had touched it. The rust-brown crosses now glistened as if wet. The following Sunday, Father Marin gave a sermon, unlike any Matthew had heard. He spoke not of Scripture, but of the necessity of silence, of the sin of stirring the bones of the faithful, of how disturbance invites visitation. His eyes never left Eloise in the pew. By February's end, Eloise disappeared. The other. Sisters claimed she had been reassigned to a convent in Albany. Matthew knew better. Her room was stripped bare except for the oilskin wrapping. The map was gone, and so Matthew began his own search, not in the garden, but in the city archives. He learned that the property ledgers Calder had been reading from were part of a sealed chancery collection, restricted for 120 years under diocesan order. They would be unsealed in 1961. Until then, the truth was bound in parchment and locked behind the cathedral's iron gates. But paper does not rot like flesh, and in some ways that made it far more dangerous. For in one entry dated 1842, buried, between dry notations about fence repairs and orchard pruning, was a line in Channing's own hand. Plots 1 to 34 consecrated as per agreement. All shall remain within sight of the convent windows. The first frost of the season clung to the orchard's gnarled trees like a silver shroud, each branch glistening under a weak dawn. For decades, townsfolk had avoided this place once winter set in, whispering that the cold revealed what summer's foliage concealed. The orchard had been planted in neat rows in 1826, a gift from the Carmichael estate to the newly founded parish orphanage. On paper, it was meant to be a place where the children could work, learn discipline, and contribute to their own upkeep. But in the unsealed files, it became clear that the orchard had served a darker purpose. Father Merrick's personal ledger, long believed destroyed, surfaced during the county archives. 1973 basement cleanout. Bound in leather that had grown brittle and cracked, its cover bore no title, only a pressed sprig of dried apple blossom, the petals browned with age. The pages inside were filled with his neat, deliberate handwriting, each entry dated and paired, with a list of names. Some bore tiny crosses beside them. Those marked names matched, almost without exception, the gravestones hidden in the orchard's farthest row stones, so small and worn that they could be mistaken for field markers. Merrick's. Entries told a tale the parish records had never dared admit, that the orchard doubled as a holding ground for the unfit children, those deemed too sickly, rebellious, or inconvenient to keep within the orphanage walls. A winter in the orchard, according to the euphemistic phrases in his notes, was a season of cleansing. In reality, it was a sentence dot by 1831. The ledger recorded 23 such cleansings. Each child moved into the small clapboard sheds among the trees. The parish claimed they were recovery cabins for convalescents. But in the biting cold, with little more than thin blankets and a stove whose fire was rationed, survival was rare. Merrick documented it clinically. January 12th, Jonathan W. Expired in the early hours. No confession offered. Remains prepared and placed per orchard custom. This orchard custom was later revealed to be burial in shallow graves between the root systems of the oldest apple trees, the earth disturbed just enough to accommodate the small bodies. When spring came, the soil was turned and saplings were grafted above them, their blossoms sweet and pale against the knowledge of what nourished their growth. The ledger also contained diagrams, crude maps of the orchard, each tree marked with an initial. Historians cross-referenced them with baptismal records and found grim correlations. Each G for Grace, H for Henry, C for Charlotte. Over time, as new plantings obscured the rows, those letters disappeared from view, but the ledger preserved their placement with unnerving precision. A series of winter sketches in Merrick's hand showed the sheds in various states of repair. In some, smoke drifted from the chimneys. In others, the roofs sagged under ice, the doors slightly ajar as though abandoned mid-season. Beside one sketch, Merrick had written only, "Silence becomes the truest charity." In 1840, a visiting diocesan inspector named Alden Brewster made a brief mention of the orchard in his official report, noting its peculiar isolation from the main orphanage grounds. He wrote, "A number of small cabins, weathered and uninviting, stand amidst the Carmichael apple trees. They are said to house those in recovery, yet no signs of healthful restoration are evident." His remarks were buried in the appendix and never acted upon. The orchard continued to operate as this unspoken extension of the orphanage's discipline for nearly 3 decades. In the later years, older boys were tasked with digging graves during winter thaws, tasks framed as character-building labor. Many of these boys would later confess, in brittle old age, to feeling the earth give way too easily, to striking wood far too soon, and to the sickening realization that the orchard soil had been turned many times before. When the orphanage closed in 1859, following an outbreak of scarlet fever, the orchard was left untended. Saplings grew wild, branches tangled. The sheds collapsed in on themselves. Yet, for reasons no one could explain, the central row of trees bloomed every spring with an almost unnatural abundance. Their apples were sweeter, their blossoms thicker, their scent heavier than anywhere else in the county. Local children dared each other to pluck the fruit, but most dropped it before taking a bite, unsettled by its faint metallic tang. Farmers swore the apples kept longer than any others in their cellars, but many refused to eat them after hearing whispers of what fed their roots. The orchard ledger vanished from public view soon after its discovery in 1973, allegedly claimed by the Diocesan Archive for safekeeping. A photocopy circulated briefly among local historians, enough for a handful of articles to be published in obscure historical journals. But then, as with many such finds, access was quietly restricted. Some said the church feared lawsuits. Others suspected a more superstitious reason, that the ledger was more than a record, that it carried the orchard's curse in its pages. Archivists who handled it reported recurring dreams of frostbitten children staring from between the trees, their lips moving silently. One archivist resigned abruptly after claiming that, on 3 separate occasions, he'd found small piles of fresh apple blossoms on his desk, despite it being February excavations in the late 1990s, undertaken before the land was slated for redevelopment confirmed what the ledger had implied. 37 small graves were found, most less than 2 feet deep. The remains were fragile, the bones stained a faint reddish brown, likely from decades of contact with iron-rich soil and decaying roots. In several cases, rosaries were recovered beads carved not from wood or stone, but from compressed apple. Seeds. One grave stood apart. Beneath the largest and oldest tree, diggers found a coffin no longer than a violin case, sealed with wax and wrapped in a length of parish altar cloth. Inside was the skeleton of an infant, its skull deformed, perhaps from birth defect, perhaps from injury. Tucked beside it was a dried apple blossom identical to the one pressed into the ledger's cover. The site was never developed. The machinery brought in to clear the orchard broke down inexplicably, engines stalling, hydraulics failing. After 3 such incidents, the developer declared the land non-viable and sold it back to the county for a fraction of its value. Today, the orchard remains fenced off, the sheds nothing more than piles of gray timber swallowed by moss. Trespassing is common, though few stay past dusk. Those who do tell of faint children's voices drifting between the rows, of the smell of apple blossoms out of season, of seeing frost cling to certain trees, even in midsummer. Hunters have reported finding fresh, bare footprints in the snow, tiny ones, leading toward the heart of the orchard, but never away from it. The ledger's final entry, dated January 3rd, 1859, 2 weeks before the orphanage closed offers. No names, only a single sentence. The roots take what the earth cannot keep, and in spring the blossoms will not betray the winter. Whether Merrick meant it as confession, justification, or something more sinister remains uncertain. But for those who stand at the orchard's edge, the meaning feels less like history and more like a warning. A final box was heavier than any of the others. Its brass clasps had fused with age, green corrosion flaking away as the archivist pried them apart. The lid groaned open, and the air that escaped was colder than it should have been, carrying with it a smell that defied easy description, not quite rot, not quite mildew, but a strange mingling of both, as if time itself had been compressed into a damp cloth and then left to ferment. Inside lay a bundle of ledgers, each bound in leather, so dark it was nearly black. Every spine bore the same symbol, a small cross overlaid by a circle, its ink still stark after all these years. Alongside them were envelopes marked not for release without episcopal approval, but the seals had been sliced already. Whoever had handled this box before had done so in secret. The first ledger opened easily, its paper surprisingly supple. It was dated 1849, the year the disappearances had reached their peak. Pages of neatly penned names filled each spread, the handwriting looping and careful. But something was wrong. Next to each name was not a date of birth or a parish record, but a set of coordinates, latitude and longitude, precise to the second. Beneath the columns, in cramped red ink, ran a repeating phrase in Latin, non in terris invenitur. It translates to, not found on earth. The more pages they turned, the more disturbing the entries became. Some bore sketches, crude outlines of human figures, their limbs bent in unnatural ways, faces obscured by smudged ink. Others contained measurements, height, weight, and something labeled only as condition at transfer. Under that heading, the notes varied from viable to altered beyond recognition. The archivist's hands shook as she reached the ledger's midpoint. Here, a large envelope had been glued directly to the page. The glue had dried and cracked, allowing them to peel, it free without tearing. Inside were 4 photographs, early daguerreotypes, each showing the same small clearing in the convent's garden. In the center of that clearing lay a trench, freshly dug, with what appeared to be fabric protruding from the soil. In one frame, a nun knelt beside it, head bowed, her hands clasped not in prayer, but in the motion of pushing something into the earth. It was Sister Agnes, the same face from the earlier investigation sketches. But here, her eyes were wide open, and the expression they carried was not grief. It was satisfaction. A second ledger, dated 1850, was stranger still. This one contained fewer names, but many more symbols, constellations meticulously charted. Beside each entry, the same ones that had been found scratched into the convent's cellar walls. At first, the arrangement seemed random, but when the archivist traced the connections with her finger, the pattern emerged. They mirrored the positions of the stars during the night. Hours of the disappearances. Why would a convent keep astronomical records alongside lists of missing parishioners? And why were the star charts annotated with phrases like Porta Apertum, the gate is open, and Clodire, ante matutinum, close before dawn? The final ledger bore no date. It began with only a sentence, scrawled in the same red, inked as the earlier notes. When the last child is taken, the garden will bloom again. Below it, dozens of blank pages. Or rather, they appeared blank until a beam of angled light struck them. Only then did faint impressions become visible, as if something had been written in pressure alone, leaving ghostly indentations. A pencil rubbing revealed the words. Repeating down the page, we go willingly. By the time the archivist and her team reached the bottom of the box, daylight was fading outside the municipal archive. The last item was not paper at all, but an object wrapped in oilcloth. Its weight suggested stone, yet when they unwrapped it, what emerged was neither stone nor wood. It was a carved fragment, about the size of a man's forearm, bearing the same cross and circle emblem, but this one had been inlaid with some metallic substance that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the dim light. The underside of the fragment bore scratches, almost like tally marks. There were 34 of them. The number matched the graves in the convent garden. When the discovery was announced, the diocese refused to comment. The garden site was reclassified as under ecclesiastical review, blocking independent excavation. But the pressure from historians, journalists, and surviving relatives of the vanished was relentless. The public wanted answers, or at least confirmation of what the ledgers implied. The official response came 6 months later. A press conference, hastily organized in the hall of the old chancery. A Monsignor in full regalia read from a prepared statement, his voice steady, his eyes scanning nothing but the text before him. The Sisters of Providence, in their service to the community, endured great hardship in the mid-19th century. Certain records from this period contain inaccuracies and embellishments, likely the result of overwrought imagination or mistranslation. We urge the faithful to place their trust in the enduring work of the Church and to refrain from speculation. When the questions began about the coordinates, the photographs, the 34 tally marks, he closed the binder and walked away from the podium. But documents, once unsealed, have a way of slipping into places they were never meant to. Go. Scans of the ledgers appeared on underground archives within weeks. Amateur cartographers plotted the coordinates on modern maps. Many of them fell on empty land, but some pointed to areas now covered by buildings, roads, or parking lots. And in more than one case, when ground was broken for new construction, workers unearthed human remains not always the same. Shallow graves, bones wrapped in fragments of black cloth, and a rosary made from beads that chemical testing could not identify. Phrase not found on Earth began appearing in online forums, a shorthand for the mystery that the official record would not touch by the story's 150th anniversary. The convent garden had been abandoned, its walls crumbling, the once meticulous paths choked with weeds. Locals avoided the place after sunset, claiming that on certain nights the air above the garden shimmered faintly, as if heat were rising from the soil, even into the dead of winter. A few swore they had heard chanting, low, rhythmic, and punctuated by what might have been a child's voice. The archivist never returned after the last box was opened. In later interviews, she would only say, "The problem isn't what we found, it's what we didn't." When pressed, she explained no further. One assistant on the project, however, told a different story. On the final night, long after the others had left, she had stayed behind to photograph the ledgers. As the flash went off, she caught, in the corner of the frame, the faint outline of someone standing behind her. The figure was dressed in a habit, but the face was obscured by shadow. When she turned, the room was empty. The photograph, of course, showed nothing but shelves. Today, the ledgers are locked once again, this time in a controlled vault far from the city. Access requires multiple levels of clearance, and requests are almost never approved. The diocese claims the documents are fragile beyond safe handling, yet rumors persist that copies exist in private collections, in the attics of old rectories, in places where the official eye cannot reach. As for the fragment of carved stone, it has vanished entirely. Its chain of custody ends with the municipal archive. The next line in the logbook simply reads, "Removed for preservation." By whom and to where is unrecorded. And so the story sits at an impasse. 34 graves in a garden. Ledgers that map the vanishings to places and times the living cannot account for. A phrase repeated across decades. We go willingly, and the faint shimmer of a garden no one tends. Whether the truth lies in earthly crime, unearthly bargain, or something between, no authority will say. But the record remains, ink on paper, coordinates on a map, photographs of Earth being closed over. And sometimes, if you stand at the edge of the old convent garden, when the light is just right, the ground looks not like soil at all, but like the surface of still water, waiting for something beneath to rise again.